Alright, so Justin Trudeau has been trending for a little while with 235,000 tweets as of now with the blackface Hitler hashtag, which I get it, but I want to actually say that a better comparison, and one that I think would be a lot more effective, would be to compare him with FDR and what FDR did with the Japanese Americans, putting them into internment camps. Because let's be real here for a second, Hitler was in power 80 years ago, and he is still brought up all the time for a sensible reason, because there's a lot to learn, oddly enough, from a mass-murdering, drug-addicted psychopath like Hitler. And by the way, I say drug-addicted because Hitler's doctors had him essentially on a form of meth for the last few years of his life. Little fun fact about him. But he was a genocidal maniac whose actions, both domestic and foreign, reverberated throughout all of human history and will continue to do so for quite some time. Trudeau, on the other hand, once he leaves office, he'll probably end up being a crappy little footnote in history, easily forgettable within a few years, maybe a decade, if we're being generous. But comparisons to Hitler, I have a few issues with. And just hear me out on this, because this is by no means a video that is favorable to Trudeau at all. Because comparisons to Hitler are too easily written off, and people on the right or the left aren't necessarily crazy when they do write that comparison off. For the simple reason that if the person in question didn't commit mass murder, mass genocide, and throw the world into chaos, then there's a significant unavoidable difference. And as bad as Trudeau is, he hasn't done that yet. He seems to be a fan of China, though. He seems to be an apologist for a mass murdering and mass incarcerating regime. That's a fair criticism for sure. And who knows, he very well might want to do something like that in Canada. And, my only evidence for that, though, really, honestly, is when he asked that question, should we tolerate the unvaccinated? That's a weird and creepy question. But like I said, I think comparing him to FDR is a lot more accurate and a lot more difficult to argue against than comparisons to Hitler. And by the way, what I'm about to say applies to Trudeau, but it also applies to every politician and every citizen that is in favor of lockdown measures and vaccine mandates and proof of vaccination requirements to enter restaurants and bars and businesses, and every person that looks down on the unvaccinated. This applies to you, so you need to know that. You are just like FDR when he threw 120,000 innocent American-born Japanese people into internment camps. Now, how can I say something like that? Well, here's how. It goes without saying that what happened to the Japanese in the U.S. in the 1940s was a disgraceful and shameful, disgusting, fear-based authoritarian approach to an issue that had an imperceivably small possibility of being true or actually dangerous. Now, that word possibility is important, because for how disgusting that was to do to the Japanese, it came from a very real fear that those Japanese could potentially be spies or saboteurs of some sort. They were born in America, but they still had family in Japan, or maybe they lived in Japan briefly as a child, or maybe even as an adult. It's possible they'll sabotage the war effort, or they're traitorous in some way, right? This is what the politicians and people that supported imprisoning those Japanese Americans were saying. And here's the kicker. It was near zero, but technically it was a non-zero probability that they were correct. Let's call it 0.01% probability that they were right. Maybe one or two out of the 120,000 they imprisoned maybe had some allegiance to Japan. Who knows? It can't be said that Japan didn't have someone, even if it was just one person, embedded in America for some nefarious purpose. Even with that potentially being true, it doesn't even remotely justify what was done to those 120,000 Japanese Americans. It doesn't even come close. Well, I'll tell you this. To any politician or citizen that agrees there should be a second-class citizen based off medical history, or to anyone who cheers Australia, for example, for putting people into camps, well, then you cannot, in good faith, disagree with the logic I just laid out. That even if there is a small chance that someone might be a danger, possibly somewhere, and maybe at some time, that qualifies them to be treated like a second-class citizen. Because that's precisely what you are doing, and that's exactly what Trudeau is doing. And it's obvious that that's what he wants with his little question, as I mentioned before, about should we tolerate the unvaccinated. Yeah, you should. Because as crazy as this may sound to the COVIDians out there, if you are unvaccinated, probability-wise, it is extremely likely, very high probability, that at any given moment, that unvaccinated person actually doesn't have COVID and isn't contagious. Just like those Japanese probably weren't a threat. And despite remaining where they were while we were at war with Japan, they refused to move. Even if their moving would have made every non-Japanese person around them a lot more comfortable, well, screw them. Those Japanese had every right to live their life how they wanted, regardless of the danger people thought they might pose, even if it was grounded in some form of, albeit twisted, reality. But anyway, that is all for now. Like, subscribe, share this video. It's extremely appreciated, and you take it easy.